friend Stan Goff had produced a documentary which I saw a couple of years ago, and that kind of inspired me to want to have a documentary about my life too. Well, my forebears came from all over Europe, and most of the families, 3 out of the 4 basically, came to live in Albany, New York. I really don't know why that happened, but at that particular time when they came to the United States, Albany was, number 1, the 10th largest community in the United States, and number 2, it was the 2nd capital of all the capitals of the states in the country. Also, Albany was a very big trading center, primarily because of the river traffic from the Hudson River, which eventually could go all the way to the Great Lakes. With the construction of the Erie Canal, Hudson River basically was connected to the Great Lakes and permitted trade to go all the way to the Midwest in the 1850s. At that particular time, the Hirschbergers and the Ilches had come to Albany. In addition to all of that, Albany had a Jewish population that was approximately 6% of that 50,000, and they all lived in what was then known as the south end of the city. The south end of the city eventually came under the hammer, so to speak, of Nelson Rockefeller when he was governor of New York. When he was governor of New York, the state constructed what is presently known as the Empire State Mall. That mall is constructed on the site where many of the Jewish families lived in the so-called south end of Albany. So there was no way for me or anybody to go back to find the family homes that existed for the Ilches and the Hirschbergers back in those days. The first part of my family to come to Albany were the Hirschbergers. They came to Albany in 1848. Bertha and Nathan were the grandparents of my mother, Sophie, and they're buried in the cemetery here in Albany.
Give me a kiss before you leave me.
The roots of my Ilch family ancestors is from Germany, in a little town called Fruchtenwagen, which is on the Romantic Trail. In 1933, a letter was received as a result of one of my cousins requesting it from the mayor of this town, who kept adequate records of all of the Jewish families that were there. And it indicates that the gravestone of great-great-great-grandparents of mine are buried in that town. Some of them born as early as 1757, Abraham Julia Ilch. And their grave sites I've never seen, but they exist according to this letter that was received before Hitler came into power in Germany. The 3 brothers of the Ilch family that emigrated from Germany are all buried in the Albany Cemetery, along with many of their descendants and my relatives.
Don't go slow, it's only green lights and all right.
Well, this was the Ilch family residence, and it included
a smile. Have a dream and cut it to fit.
Sam and Esther Perlmutter originally lived in a town which is now part of Hungary, and it was a town where Sam, who had been in the Hungarian army, retired, and he and Esther built a general store and a house in a small community. They had 8 or 9 children in that area, and then in 1884, the whole family picked up sticks from Hungary and moved to the United States. They located in New York City, and Sam had accumulated enough wealth at that time so that he could be a stay-at-home dad with all of his children. The children included my grandmother, Sadie Pearl. Sam Schwartz came to Albany, New York when he was about 20 or 21 years old. After he established himself in 1890 and the following years after that, he brought his brothers and a half-sister to Albany also. Sam originally located in New York City, but while he was in Albany, he would travel back to New York City, and he met a woman there by the name of Sadie Pearl. And they got married in New York City, and in 1896, my father was born in New York City. And in 1900, my Uncle Morty was born in Albany, New York. So the Albany connection continued after approximately 1895, 96, somewhere around there, when Sam and Sadie did take up residency in Albany. My grandfather, Sam Schwartz, was a very aggressive person. He was generally known as the boss. He was a very smart businessman, and he was also an inventor. He patented an invention that was intended to prevent cotton from shrinking. Clewood Peabody took up the patent and paid him royalties for several years. My mother, Sophie, and my father, Rudy, were both students at Albany High School, and I think they were in the same class. They both graduated, I think, in 1913. And they knew each other from the high school era, and my father went on to go to Union College, and my mother went to work in her father's store. As time went on, Rudy finished Union College in 1917, then had to serve part-time in the U.S. Navy during World War I. After he was discharged from the Navy, in I think about 1919, he courted Sophie, and eventually in 1920, on June 21st, the longest day of the year, they got married. They spent their honeymoon in Atlantic City, which was a fashionable thing to do at that time.
And now the purple dusk of twilight time steals across the meadows of my heart. High up in the sky, the little stars climb, always reminding me that we're apart. You wander down the lane and far away, leaving me a song that will not die. Love is now the stardust of yesterday.
Uncle Morty was like a brother to me, even though he was considerably older. We both loved golf. He loved music. He played the piano beautifully, and he lived a very raucous life for a young man, and then finally got married.
He says, well, you remember my Uncle Morty, who passed away, and in his will or his dying wish was that his remains be sprinkled over, he was cremated, and his remains be sprinkled over the golf course at a sanctuary. And we went out and hit the ball, Bill hit the ball, sprinkled Uncle Morty. Is that right?
In about the 1916 era, the Ilch family moved from South Pine Avenue to Myrtle Avenue. They had constructed a large house there, and that house now is divided into 4 individual apartments. The house at the time they lived there contained my grandmother and grandfather, their son Maurice Ilch, their daughter Sophie Ilch, my mother, and when she got married, Rudy Schwartz, and when I was born, me. In addition to that, Sophie's sister Bertina had been married at one point in time to a Schenectady lawyer by the name of Ralph Urey. However, that marriage dissolved in a divorce, and she came back and lived in the house also. So it was a pretty full house with all of those people hanging around while I was growing up. While I was growing up on Myrtle Avenue, I had a lot of fun with the neighbor kids. We used to play out in the street, and we used to play stoop ball by throwing a ball against the stoop and trying to catch it and pretending we were baseball players in the big leagues and reciting names like Ruth and Gehrig and all of the other famous athletes at that time. In addition, we lived very close to a park called Richfield Park. And Richfield Park was a wonderful place for kids to play. They had a baseball field, they had a football field, they had a tennis court, and it was so close by it took only a couple of minutes to walk there, and it was not usually very crowded, so we always had a chance to do the things that we did. During the Depression, when things were very difficult economically for almost all of the American people at that time, I tried my own little way to help the family. I used to deliver circulars for the Madison Theater, which was close by to where we lived, and those deliveries permitted me to have a pass to go to the theater as many times as I wanted each week. In addition to that, during the winter time, I usually shoveled a lot of snow to try to pick up 50 cents here and 25 cents there, whatever it might be, to earn a little bit of money to help my parents along. Also in our backyard we had fruit trees, and it was an annual thing for me to pick some of the cherries off of the tree and take them to a small grocery store who would buy them from me. In addition to that, I peddled some of the cherries from door to door around the neighborhood. I also made my attempt of making money by selling magazines for Curtis Publishing Company. Not very successfully, I would say, but nevertheless it was regarded as an effort on my part to try to help the finances of the Schwartz family. During the Depression, my mother made her effort to try to economically help the family along. She took a job with a dress store selling dresses, and she also modeled the dresses. As a matter of fact, I have a picture of an ad that the store placed in the local paper with my mom modeling a dress. In addition to that, she used to work regularly at the voting polls and had her picture taken regularly with the mayor of Albany, Mayor Thatcher, who lived on the same block we did on Myrtle Avenue. My neighborhood friend Harold Dorn and I had an adventure that lasts in my memory for many, many years. It happened when I was about 10 years old in about 1932, during the depths of the Depression. I stole $1 from my mother. She had a hiding place where she kept some extra money back in those days. So Harold Dorn and I went to the A&P store on Madison Avenue, and back in those days, large candy bars were available at the price of 3 for 10 cents. So Harold and I bought 30 candy bars, brought them home, ate a lot of them until I got found out and I was accused of taking money, but no punishment ensued, and I enjoyed the candy for a long time. My father lost his job at Cluett Peabody. My uncle had a job with a Puro filter company that had water, ice water coming out of a machine, and they were both out of work, and it was the depths of the Depression. So the two of them started delivering beer when beer became licensable and distributable. And they did that out of my grandfather and grandmother's house. And then a guy came along and said, "You two young men ought to go in the liquor business with me. I'm going to get a license." And that's what happened. He got a license. He hired my uncle and my father, and the three of them ran a store in downtown Albany called Winchell's. The first day it opened after Prohibition,
Oh my God.
the inventory was sold out completely.
I'm sure of that.
My childhood education was all taken care of by the Albany Academy, a school that was established 200 years ago. When I joined the Academy in 1928, I was one of the 10 or 12 students who finished the entire course through graduation. My experiences there were varied. I had some happy moments and some unhappy moments. There was one kid in my class who was bigger than I was. He was stronger than I was. I was a little kid. And he beat me up and called me a dirty Jew, and I didn't like that at all. It's a lifetime experience that I truly am unhappy about. And yet there were other occasions when I had friends and fellowship with the students that I was in attendance with, and generally I had a good time. In 1940, I graduated from the Albany Academy and took a summer job in Albany and was allowed to enter NYU in September. When I went down there, I immediately started sleeping and eating at the ZBT fraternity. I lived there for most of the first semester, became a pledge to ZBT, and joined the fraternity. From there on, I continued my studies in accounting and became ultimately the president of the fraternity and gathered a great friend, Bernie Moncharge, who unfortunately died at the age of 39. Eventually, of course, I had to be in the Army. I was in the ROTC at college, and they became activated as part of the regular Army, and my Army career started. So during the World War II, I had to serve in the Army, and I was in France. I landed in Normandy in D-Day plus 20, and it was a pretty hot beach at that particular point in time. And I was a member of the 90th Infantry Division. And after a little while, the beachhead was expanded from where it was in Normandy, and our troops enveloped the German troops and were able to move through France pretty readily. So from June and July and August, the fighting got a little bit easier. But in August and September, it got a little bit tougher for me because we eventually were outside of Strasbourg in Germany and outside of Metz in Germany. We never got to Germany, but at that particular time, on September 14th, a shell came down. I was in a foxhole and I was wounded. And the person I was in the foxhole with was a company aide man, and unfortunately the shell killed him. But there was medicine right nearby, and somebody graciously stuck the needle with some morphine in me to alleviate the pain that I was going through from the wounds that were in my legs. Both legs were injured and I could not walk. But eventually some troops came along with a stretcher, put me on the stretcher and tried to carry me down this hill. As they were in the process of doing it, continuous fire continued and mortars were falling all over the place, and as each one sounded as if it was coming down, the 4 guys who were carrying me dropped the stretcher, ran for cover, and left me lying there. Eventually, they got me down to the bottom of the hill and put me on a jeep and carried me from there to a field hospital where some doctors took care of my wounds. Back in the 1914 era, Colony Country Club was established. It was primarily established to help provide a place for Jewish people to be able to try to play golf. And it was the only place in the Albany, Troy, Schenectady area where they could do that. Grandparents, Sam and Sadie Schwartz, my father's parents, were among the first members of the Colony Country Club. My parents had belonged to the club prior to the Depression, but during the Depression they had to resign. But in 1938 they rejoined the club and I became a junior member. My dues was $3.68 a month. I was discharged in June and had all summer long to do lots of different things. My father knew an orthopedic surgeon, Phil Foster, and we went to see him about my legs, and Phil said, "Do you like to play golf?" And I said, "I played it as a kid." And they said it would be good for you because it would help strengthen your legs. So that started a whole event of golfing for the rest of my life, basically. I played almost every day at Colony Country Club during June, July, and August before college started, and I got pretty good. As a matter of fact, in 1945, when there were not many good golfers at Colony Country Club to begin with, I won the club championship. That's the 3rd green, and I got my first hole-in-one on that hole about 50 years ago. Well, Irving L. Simon and Company hired Bill Schwartz in, I guess, 1946, and by 1949 or so I had passed my CPA exam, and I was working with a bunch of guys that I enjoyed being with, and all of a sudden the proprietor of the firm wanted to retire. He said, "Buy me out." So 4 of us, Sal Shea, George Lutz, John King, and myself, bought out Irving Simon over a period of time, and we changed the name of the firm to Shea, Lutz, Schwartz & King. Our firm expanded greatly. Although we had our problems, we had our successes at the same time. It was an enjoyable thing. The 4 of us got along very well. The firm grew and grew and grew. When Emily and I decided to revisit Albany in the year 2014, we decided that we should try to get together with some of the people I knew there. So I had one of my former partners, Doris Shamlian, gather the group of Shea, Lutz, Schwartz & King alumni in a luncheon setting that we had at a motel in Albany. And that was a great affair as far as I was concerned, seeing people I hadn't seen in many years and enjoying people that I had worked with. We had 4 partners in Shea, Lutz, Schwartz & King. Sal Shea was the working partner, John King was the eating partner, George Lutz was the drinking partner, and I was the golfer. As the firm expanded, it became more and more difficult to get good help, and the accounting profession was running into one problem or another, and we were thinking about our retirement, that is George, Saul, John, myself, and we decided that we would merge in with Coopers and Lybrand when they offered us that opportunity. When that opportunity arose, we each arranged our own schedule of retirement, and once the merger took place, I decided that I would retire within 3 years at the age of 62. During the period after the war, when I was working in the accounting office, I naturally sought out some girlfriends and dated a lot of people. I went from A to Z in the Albany, Troy, and Schenectady area and didn't really find anybody that I cared about. My almost sister, Audrey Bloom, who married Bob Myers, lived in Hartford, Connecticut, and I phoned her once to ask her if she could fix me up with a date with some girl from Hartford. All of a sudden, I met the girl who became my future wife, Peggy, and we started dating, and we dated kind of frequently, and I kept going over to Hartford, and she on occasion came over to Albany. She met my family, I met her family. We found a lot of enjoyment being with each other, and eventually we fell in love, got engaged, and Peggy became my wife for the next 60 years. I had no first cousins, and I had no nieces or nephews. And when I married Peggy, she had a big family. She had a brother who was married with children. She had a sister who was married with children. Mm-hmm. And so I really adopted the Hartford family because I had none of my own. My mother and father never owned a house of their own until the early 1950s. Just before Peggy and I got married, they moved into the house that they designed and constructed on Manning Boulevard. It was a modern, nice house, and they entertained nicely in it. When Peggy and I first got married, we lived in an apartment on New Scotland Avenue, and we lived there for 2 years. During that period of time, Peggy was able to save $5 a week and put it into the bank, and with that accumulation of money, plus other monies that we both had, we managed to buy a house on Cambridge Road. Cambridge Road was a wonderful place for children to grow up. We bought the house because it was a 4-bedroom house, and it was prior to the birth of Emily. But she came shortly after we moved in, and both Emily and Jeff played in the boulevard area of the street, which was quite wide, very grassy, tree-laden area that was very conducive for kids, especially during the nice weather. In addition to that, in our backyard we had a little bit of a hill, and as the kids got older, we used that hill to help learn how to ski. Our very good friends Sid and Sue Stein, in 1965 or so, moved into a new area that was being developed by a developer who was building several houses. When we went out to visit Sid and Sue, we saw a house under construction that Peggy and I both loved. It was a wonderful house as far as we were concerned. We looked at it, eventually we bought the house, made a few changes in the general construction, and then we moved into it in 1966. While we were living in Newell Court, Peggy and I entertained my entire family, what there was of it, and we would always have guests for Thanksgiving and Christmas and other holidays or birthdays or anniversaries. We were party givers, and we enjoyed entertaining the family and our friends who came to visit us at that time. And the first one I can remember was in 1960, which was Rudy and Soph's, my parents' 40th anniversary party. And we gave them a surprise 40th anniversary party, which was a wonderful success. Then after that, they returned the favor by giving Peggy and me our 10th anniversary party at their house with all of our friends. And subsequently, Peggy gave me a birthday party for my 50th birthday and for my 60th birthday and for my 70th birthday. And we also had parties for our anniversaries. Going backwards, we had one down. During the earliest period of my meeting Peggy, her mother told me that Peggy was perfect, and Peggy was. She was the sweetest person I ever got to know in my entire life. And she was charming, she was smart, she was able to maintain a household beautifully, she entertained beautifully, she made everybody she met happy. And Peggy was very smart. She read lots of books. She read a book a week. She did crossword puzzles, and she was very active in areas outside of the family. She was active in the Albany Boys and Girls Club, and she was a vice president of the auxiliary there. She was very active at hospitals, reading to children and taking care of them as best she could while they were in the hospital. She did many club shows by writing parodies to songs. She used to write songs for friends who had anniversaries or birthdays. She was a lyricist. She played the piano. She was extremely talented in every way. In 1980, there was an independent candidate by the name of John Anderson, who was a third-party candidate running against Governor Reagan and at that time President Carter. And Peggy became heavily involved to the extent that she ran 13 counties in New York State on behalf of John Anderson, who unfortunately ran an unsuccessful campaign. I became heavily involved in community jobs or service in the Albany area. I became a member of the board of Temple Beth Emeth. I was president of the Jewish Family Service. I was on the board of the Jewish Community Center. I was quite active, and I also was a treasurer of the Hudson Valley Auto Club, in addition to other things that I can scarcely remember at this point. This land was purchased by basically me on behalf of the Colony Country Club. I discovered it, and it turned out to be a beautiful location. The soil is good, and the weather is fine, and the trees and grass make it look very beautiful. I was also heavily involved in professional affairs. I was a member of the CPA Society. I became president of the Albany chapter of CPAs and vice president of the New York State Society of CPAs. And I wrote some articles for professional magazines, including the Journal of Accountancy and the New York State publication. Well, Peggy and I naturally wanted children after we were married, and we were very fortunate to have Emily and Jeff as our marriage progressed along. Emily was born in 1954 and Jeff in 1957, and Peggy and I loved them greatly as any parent would love their child, and we enjoyed being with them in both their school activities and their growing up and their outside activities, which included various things. Emily in some shows, and Jeffrey doing his thing with piano and violin at an early age. And we took the children on vacations. We took them skiing. We took them to Bermuda. We took them to Florida. On one occasion we took them to Baltimore, and they never delivered our clothes, and that created a trauma for everybody. But we thoroughly enjoyed the children and loved bringing them up.
Kiss today goodbye, the sweetness and the sorrow. Wish me luck the same to you, but I can't regret what I did for love, what I did made for love. Look, my eyes are dry. The gift was ours to borrow. It's as if we always knew, and I won't forget what I did for love, what I did for love.
Peggy and I were blessed having 2 grandchildren actively being brought up while we were aging ourselves, and during that period of time those 2 grandchildren became adults. At the same time that they became adults, we got 2 more grandchildren who entertained us as we aged gracefully into our older years. My great uncle Julius Ilch was a lawyer who became a very prominent person in Albany. He became a judge in Albany. He was elected to a municipal court and served a couple of terms as the justice in Albany. In addition to his position as a judge, he was elected to the board of trustees of the bank, which was now presently Key Bank, and he was also a member of the board of Memorial Hospital, and he was a famous man in the community. Rudy's first cousins, born of his father's brother, Yeno, lived in New York City, and I never really got to know them until later in life. But Yeno had 2 daughters, one of whom was Evelyn, who became a very famous person in the United States, actually. She got married 3 times, the first time to a puppeteer by the name of Bill Baird, who was on television, the second time to an Arctic explorer who eventually taught at Dartmouth College, and finally to an heir to a huge fortune who happened to be a professor at the University of Chicago, and he owned a lot of original Picasso and Monet printings, and they had a wonderful life together, and their best friends were Mark and Yaya Chagall. Her sister, Julie, left the family home and went into show business. She was actually a Ziegfeld girl and changed her name from Julie Schwartz to Julie Jenner. When my father had his liquor store, he had hired a manager whose name was Bob Langer Sr., and Bob Langer Sr. had a son. Well, Bob Langer's son was Bob Langer Jr., and he became a famous person. He was a university professor at MIT. He invented so many things, it's hard to tell all of them, but I believe he has more than 300 US patents at this point. We met Bob and his mother in Boston while we were on our trip back to Albany. Bob was mentioned in Time magazine a few years ago as being one of the 100 greatest scientists of our time.
To remember the kind of September when life was slow and oh so mellow. Try to remember the kind of September when grass was green and grain so yellow. Try to remember the kind of September when you were a young and callow fellow. Try to remember to remember when life was so tender that no one wept except the willow. Try to remember when life was so tender that dreams were kept beside your pillow. Try to remember when life was so tender that love was an ember about to billow. Try to remember, and if you remember, then follow. December, it's nice to remember, although you know the snow will follow. Deep in December, it's nice to remember without a hurt. The heart is
This is the first venture that Emily and I have undertaken to film part of my life's history, and of course the life of my wife and my children and members of my family.
Deep in December, our hearts should remember, then follow.